Hey guys, what is going on? It is the faithful Brook, or the Undead DM, as you may have known by this point in time. And in this episode of my rants videos, it's going to be a semi-response mixed with my own opinions thrown in there. It's not a direct response. It's not like my checklist design can be good video from a couple of videos back. It's not anything like that. It's just more of going over some points of a preview of a video that was made by Cybrock Opinions and giving my takes on them. So, the two videos in particular I'm referring to are Cybrock's Spells and Spells Part 2 videos. Links in the description. And in those videos, he talks about spellcasters and how spells, they are basically the maneuvers or the options that spellcasters have that martials don't in 5th edition, and that's a big problem. But the primary issues, or the primary things I took from the videos that would be, to me, an issue, are spells in 5th edition. They typically have one of two extremes. It's never in between. I don't think I've met a perfectly balanced spell. Or I've never heard anyone say that a spell is perfectly balanced. And that it is situationally useful, but in those situations it is extremely useful, but the situations that it comes up in are frequent enough to warrant taking it, but also not so frequent that it becomes a catch-all. The two extremes in this instance are underpriced, i.e. the spell is of a low enough level that it doesn't hurt you to take it, and the effect that you get from it is so high comparative to what martials can do or what other spells can do at the same level that it is basically a no-brainer that you take. Instances of this: if you want to deal damage at 5th level, you take Fireball or Lightning Bolt, because they deal the most damage. Then also for 3rd level, if you're playing anything, you could also take Conjure Animals if you have access to that spell. Slow. Those are just really good spells. Alternatively, the other side of that spectrum is that the effect that you get is either inconsequential or is up to DM fiat as to how they want to make it function. So things like See Invisibility is way too high of a level to be worth taking. And in my opinion, I think the spell Detect Magic is too high to be worth taking. Because in a recent video that Cybrock had uploaded, I think he uploaded it earlier today, was talking about how in earlier editions, particularly 4th edition, I know, surprising, we're talking about 4th edition again, but how in 4th edition, you can just make an Arcana check and you can detect magic. So the fact that in an earlier edition, a spell whose sole function is to detect magic could be done without expending a spell slot, and could be done for free, and is in the rulebook that you could do that if you made an Arcana check high enough, is interesting. Because that implies that they decided that some of these mechanics didn't need to be in the game as a catch-all, so they just moved it to spellcasters and gave them even more options, as opposed to letting it be just a skill check that you can do, and thus allows everybody to do it. So it's not that far-fetched to think that if someone like a fighter or a barbarian would be able to know what a magical weapon does, or what a magic shield or set of armor does, and why they need a wizard who's probably never had to use any of these, what they would do. Why would a wizard who thematically is meant to spend all their time researching in books and casting spells, using their arcane focus, why would they know anything about a magic weapon like a sword or a shield or a suit of armor when they don't use them themselves? You would think that the people who use those things would know more about it. So, granted, this is basing it off the Arcana skill, which is primarily an intelligence skill, which obviously primarily wizards and artificers would use, as well as a few subclasses, but I digress. We're not talking about that right now. The fact that spells in 5th edition are either underpriced and overtuned for their effects, or they are overpriced and undertuned for their effects, is the primary problem. There are very clear lines in the sand as to spells that you should and should not take. Should you take See Invisibility? Probably not, when Fairy Fire is right there and it does something similar. And is cheaper, easier to use. So why would you take See Invisibility when you could use it to cast Fireball or Lightning Bolt, or Slow, or Conjure Animals, or any of the other really good 3rd level spells? Doesn't make any sense. So, the other problem with spells in 5th edition I find very similar to Cybrock is that spells in 5th edition apply effects that break the conventional rules of the game. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Spells and effects can break the rules of the game if it makes sense and it is priced appropriately. But let's go back to one of the spells I just spoke about, Slow. Slow has an effect that states that while a creature is slowed, if they attempt to cast a spell, they have to make a check. And if they fail the check, they have to spend their next action on their turn to cast the spell. And if they fail the check, they just don't cast the spell at all. It's gone. They expend the spell slot, the spell fizzles, and they just wasted their action. That's not an effect that is present in the game outside of the slow effect. But you would think that something like the Silence spell should offer a debuff that makes it so that anything that requires a verbal component wouldn't be able to be used, which is exactly what it does. But that's not, Silenced is not a condition applied. It is a unique effect to the Silence spell. So a lot of these spells can be boiled down to the equivalent of a cantrip's level of text if they just used more conditions in the game. Because I think that's the main issue with spells and the game in 5th edition in general, is that they don't have enough conditions to cover everything. For instance, why is the spell Heat Metal the only spell that does consistent fire damage when other spells should realistically catch things on fire and deal damage? Like, yes, obviously making Fireball have a similar effect to Heat Metal would be a little bit strong in terms of damage output, but that's why we nerf the damage and make it more in line with what other people can do. Wow, who would have thought? Changing spellcasters and nerfing spellcasters? Wizards of the Coast doing that? No. But the point still stands, is that a lot of spells can have their mechanical bloat slimmed down by just adding more conditions that cover the basis of what the effect is trying to do. So the slow spell could easily have an effect that applies a debuff called slowed, and it offers some of the benefits that the slow spell already does. But then it cuts down on that whole explaining about what the slowed condition can do by just having it be a condition, and you can look into the book and figure out what it does, as opposed to having to read the spell and figure it out. A great example of this would be that in my homebrews, I've actually made something that is a encyclopedia of conditions that you can apply into your game, as well as reworks to existing conditions to make them less powerful, but also you can apply them to more things. So, for instance, a few of the conditions, primarily paralyzed and stunned, aren't as good, and incapacitated has basically stayed the same. So incapacitated, it still makes it so you can't take actions or reactions, but all the conditions are based on the premise of an effect applying them gives you the duration. So for instance, if you're playing my rogue, they have an ability called Blindside, where they throw pocket sand into somebody's eyes. And when they do this, they become blinded until the start of your next turn. And the blinded condition makes it so that you have disadvantage on attack rolls and spell attacks. Like, you have a disadvantage on all attack rolls and spells that require line of sight. So any spell that says you target a creature you could see within range, you can't use it because you're blinded. And additionally, while blinded, you grant advantage on attack rolls against you. But there isn't a set duration for any of the conditions. It is based on the effect that is applying it. So, an effect like Stunning Strike could still be relevant, but since the stunned condition is slightly weaker than what it is in 5th edition, having it be as it is isn't a problem. There's also other conditions like Ablaze, which does fire damage. There's the decaying one. There's the decaying condition, which makes it so that your flesh begins to decay. There's Cursed, Rejuvenation. There's Melting, which is acid. There's a lot. There's also the new Marked condition. There's a lot of new conditions. Eventually, hopefully, by the time I can get around to making more consistent homebrew review content again, I will release an update, similar to how Cybrock's been doing with his Legends and Lore playtests. I'll be releasing updates on what I am doing in terms of homebrew. But I guess the moral of this episode is nerf? No, I wouldn't say nerf. I'd say make unique conditions and apply them to spells that make sense. Oh, and also, remove the whole stacking spell effects thing. I think that might help the bounded accuracy, the whole bounded accuracy thing that 5th edition tried to go for. Like, make it so that if you have a bonus to something, or you add a die roll to something, you can't add something like that again. So, for instance, if you are trying to make an attack roll and you have like a Valor Bard, I think they're the only ones that can do that. But like, if you have a Valor Bard and they give you inspiration and you have advantage from using an effect, that's fine. But if something tries to give you an additional die roll, like Bless, one of those two cancels out. So like Bless or Bardic Inspiration, you can't use both. You have to use one or the other. And I think that would help trim down on the whole, you can get like plus 90 to a check, because then you can only use the one. And also bonuses like this, they will only The only ones that will stack will be advantage. So, like, there'll be advantage where you roll 2d20, take the higher result, and disadvantage, you take the lower result of the two. But depending on which one you gain a +1 per instance of advantage or -1 to instance of disadvantage, and they're the only things that stack. But things like bless, bardic inspiration, normal inspiration, anything that adds to a roll, you can only use one of, and you have to choose which one you're using at the time. So it kind of validates making your character more optimal. Yeah, I think that's it.